If you've been here, you've sort of tracked along with us, and if you haven't, probably means you were sick last week. So many people have been sick recently, and I would encourage you, I don't often do this, but I would really encourage you, if you have not been here for the first 2 weeks of our series, to go and either check it out on our webpage under the media section, or go to YouTube, to our YouTube channel, and check it out, because just from the feedback I've been getting, people are just telling me this is what I needed to hear. So I'm just taking a chance that if that's what they needed to hear, it's probably what you maybe need to hear as well. So I want to encourage you just to check out that series. 2 weeks ago, I told you that I had 2 stories where I nearly drowned. And last week, 2 weeks ago, I told you one of those stories was when I was in a triathlon, and how everybody was just beating me up and kicking me and all that. And I thought I was going to drown. In fact, the rescue boat sort of came over like, "Do you need help?" And I was like, "No, I'm not going out like this." And so how I worked through that situation. Well, today I want to tell you my first I About Drowned story. I was a young kid in Virginia, and though here it's a little more commonplace to have a pool or access to a friend who has a pool or whatever, in Virginia you really don't. And so what I tell my kids all the time is what I loved about vacation was going to get in the pool. Because we would go to a hotel that had a pool, or we would go to the beach that had a pool, or whatever it was. That was my treat as a kid, was being able to get into a pool. And so we were on vacation one summer, and we went to my cousin's house, who they lived in an apartment. So the apartment had a pool, and my cousin, who was a teenager, said, "Well, why don't we go swimming?" I said, "Okay, that sounds great." And so we went down to the pool. My grandparents were there, and my mom was there, and my cousin's parents were there and stuff, and we were just sort of swimming around. And then she got this inner tube out, and she started diving off the diving board through the inner tube. Some of you probably do that now. I was probably about 7. I said, "Well, I'm not diving. I didn't know how to dive, but I'm going to jump through the inner tube." And so I go off the diving board, and the inner tube is sort of in there, and you know how it sort of moves a little bit. And when I went, instead of going through the inner tube, I actually straddled the inner tube. And if you know anything about water displacement and weight distribution, that when I hit this side of the inner tube, it sort of pushed it down, but it didn't bring it up to float. It literally pushed down and then flipped over. And when it did, I took my legs and grabbed around the inner tube because I was sort of scared. And so I'm holding onto the inner tube that is actually holding me underwater, and I'm trying to use my hands to get up to the top of the water, and I can't. And I'm not exactly sure what I did that made my cousin say he's going to drown or whatever, but she literally jumped in, grabbed me, and sort of brought me over to the side of the pool. And it's one of those where you're coughing up water and, oh man, and all that kind of stuff. And so to this day, I have a fear of inner tubes. I mean, today, I don't jump through inner tubes. And I know what you're saying. I don't jump through inner tubes of any size. All right. Tractor trailer tires. I don't jump through the inner tubes of those anymore. Okay? Here's how bad it is. I even get nervous when there's kids swimming and they're jumping and diving through inner tubes. Like there'll be some people at our house and they'll just be doing it, and I'm literally sitting there watching, just making sure they go through. Just go through. Just go through. Just go through. One time we had a kindergarten end of the year party at our house, and a bunch of kids came, and their moms and dads were there, and I was grilling hot dogs, and I was so nervous about this whole inner tube thing, I had hired a private lifeguard to watch the pool while I cooked hot dogs. That's how nervous I am about this whole inner tube thing. Lo and behold, a kid has an inner tube and goes climbing up the slide, and later we found out in his mind, he knew he couldn't swim. In his mind, the inner tube was going to keep him afloat. Well, he went down the slide, and when he hit the water, the inner tube went and just shot off. And this kid came up once and went down once, and he came up twice and he went down twice, and he's just flailing his legs, and I'm sitting there cooking hot dogs, and the lifeguard's sitting there on the side of the pool, and finally I go up to him and go, "I think you need to get him." And he goes down for the 3rd time, and sure enough, the lifeguard pulls him out. He's spitting up water. I'm just telling you, inner tubes are bad things. That's where I'm trying to go with this. No, I'm not really trying to go there with this. But the reality is that we all live with a certain amount of fear in our lives. Some fear that we have is sort of healthy. I think it's something God gave us called common sense. I mean, I think if you go look over a cliff, 100-foot cliff, without any rope ties or anything like that, you need to be scared. It's called common sense. But what I find out is that a lot of us, instead of just living with some fears, some of us, and many of us, I found out this week as I studied, are sort of living lives that are paralyzed by fear. By things that we are afraid of. It's the reason that some people can't go to sleep at night because of their fear. It's the same reason why some people wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because of their fear. It's the reason that some people will not go out in public or not go to social places or not go to a restaurant to eat because they have fears. And for some people, fear becomes paralyzing. And when it becomes paralyzing, you begin to try to cope and figure out, how can I work with this fear that's in my life? What can I do? How can I handle this? And for some people, they medicate themselves to handle the fear. Some people medicate themselves with a prescription that a doctor may give them. Other people choose to medicate themselves with things that doctors don't give you. Some people use food as a way to cope with a fear that they're facing or a struggle that they have going on. Some people use alcohol as a way to numb the fear that they're living with day in and day out. And so they just come home and pop open a bottle, and they've just got to have that to help them cope with the fear that's in their lives. Webster's defines fear this way. It's really deep. To be afraid of. Can you believe that's the best Webster could come up with? To be afraid of. Other words, you would think of worry, anxiety, being anxious. Louis Giglio has the best definition of fear that I've ever heard. I'm going to just read it to you. It says, when we believe that apart from or in spite of my best effort, something bad is going to happen to me and I can't stop it. That is a tremendous definition of fear. Now, I came up with one. It's not as good as Louis, but here's my definition of fear. Fear is the presence of doubt that comes from a lack of trust. It's a presence of doubt that comes from a lack of trust. And that could apply to just so many situations. When I was a young kid, I went and spent the summer with a set of cousins. Now, I have two sides of my family. I have one side of my family that was sort of in the city, that kind of thing. I have another side of my family that was in the woods. Like you went off the paved road a long way to get to their house. When you got to their house, they had outdoor plumbing. Now, this was in the 70s. I think they've got indoor plumbing now, but the summer I stayed with them, it was outdoor plumbing. And I told you the story many, many times of how you had to get up every morning and go feed the pigs. I mean, that was where I was living for about 4 weeks during the summer. Now, the cool part about where they lived is they lived right beside, I don't know if you call it a creek or a river. It wasn't big enough to be a river. It was a little bigger than a creek. But it was one of those places we would go out just in our bathing suits out in the middle of it, and you could fish. Okay, you didn't have to have waders and stuff. You just went out in your bathing suit and fished. And it was one of those where it had some places that were deep enough to swim in, but it had also a lot of places where there were a lot of rocks and a lot of things like that, so you didn't want to mess with that. Well, my cousins called me, let's go down to the creek or whatever it is. And we went down there. And at this creek, there is a swinging bridge. Anybody familiar with swinging bridges? Okay, those are basically bridges that have been engineered by rednecks, okay, with redneck tools, redneck ingenuity, redneck ability, whatever. And it literally is ropes tied to one side of a bank. That ropes go all the way across, and then to make you feel safe and secure, they put some old rickety boards on it. And they call it a swinging bridge simply because from the first step you take on there, that whole thing is moving. And they're like, come on. Of course, they lived there. It was nothing for them. Come on, let's go across the bridge. I'm like, I'm not going across that bridge. I mean, I just look at it. It's moving. It's swaying. It's swinging. The rope looks like it's 100 years old. The boards, 2 or 3 of them are even broken out. What are you guys doing? Oh, come on, Rick, man, come on. And they had one spot in the creek or river, whatever you will call it, that was deep enough that you could climb over the side of the swinging bridge, jump off into the water. Just one little area was big enough for you to do that. And so, come on, Rick, you got to do this, man. I said, I'm not going on that bridge. See, I had this doubt that those ropes were not going to hold me. I had this fear, and it was real, that if I go out on that thing, it's going to collapse, and it's going to fall, and it's going to, it's going to be done. My summer's over. That's what a lot of us live with. We live with this doubt. And what happens is, regardless of what that doubt is, it comes from a lack of trust. I got some statistics this week from the medical profession. Do you realize that 90% of the things that we worry about are really insignificant issues? 90% of the things that we worry about aren't about the affairs of the Middle East, aren't about, maybe 10% is about the economy, or 10% are about real big issues. The other 90% of the things we are worried about are, do my shoes match my outfit? How does my hair look? Do I look okay today? How's that going to play out today? And 90% of the things we worry about are insignificant. And get this, 60% of the stuff that we worry about is stuff that will never take place. I know many of you watch The Walking Dead, and so you walk in fear of the zombie apocalypse that may happen. You're afraid to go to Walmart because right around the corner could be that zombie that's just going to chew your guts out or whatever. Never gonna happen. But so many of us spend so much time. There are 6.3 million people that live with phobias, that live with real fears. There's 74% of people have a fear of public speaking. Basically what that means is that in this room, 74% of you would not want to dare come up here and speak. I'd like to know who the other 26% are, but that's what the reality says, is that 74% of us would never want to public speaking. 68% are afraid of death, and I think it's sort of odd that we're more scared of speaking in public than dying. I think that's a little odd. And then the third place finisher in the phobia world is 30% of people are afraid of spiders. So that's the three things that we're afraid of. We're afraid of public speaking, we're afraid of death, and we're afraid of spiders. Most of us live with some sense of fear, and most of us aren't paralyzed by it. But see, most of us have been trained, or some of us have been brought up in a world that has produced fears in our life. And if you don't believe me, take small children to a hotel. Okay? Walk in, what's the first thing they do? They drop their bags, if they even carried their bags, and they go and hop on the bed, right? And they hop from this bed to that bed. They do back flips and they do front flips, and they're not the ones worried about them getting hurt. Who's the ones worried about them getting hurt? The parents. Oh, don't do that, baby. You're going to get hurt. Don't do that. Don't do that. You're going to get hurt. And so some of us are raised in a world, in fact, there's three different ways that fear develops in our lives. Here's the first one: conditioning. Some of us were just raised by overprotective parents. Some of us were just raised by parents who didn't want us to get dirty. That parent, and I'm just going to be honest, I don't want you to get mad, it was usually mom. Because most of the dads are, he'll learn. Let him face plant off of the swing set. He'll learn not to do that again. Mama's the one saying, you're going too high. You're going too high. Don't go too high. Come down from that. Some of us have been raised by parents that from the time we come out of the womb, they've always been worried that something bad's going to happen. And so that's why when you go to the mall, you walk in a cloud of Lysol spray around you because there's germs at the mall and you can get sick because there's germs. That's why when you go out for soccer or for baseball or basketball, you're wrapped in bubble wrap because somebody's afraid that the ball could hit you, the ball could come at you, you could get hurt. And so some of us have been conditioned in our lives to be afraid. To be afraid of so many things. The second way is through experience. Some of us have experienced events, relationships, situations situations at work, situations at home, that give us this history, that give us this baggage, so much so that we're afraid to open ourselves back up to that again. It could be a broken relationship. It could have been someone you were dating that broke your heart. And because of that, because of the pain that brought, and that pain was real, you're afraid of that pain ever happening again. And so you cut yourself off from any other relationship. It could be a job, and in that job, you really got done wrong. I mean, they really did you wrong. And so now in your job that you're in, you're just watching out for number one, and I'm going to watch out for me. Why? Because I don't want that to happen to me. So some of us have been conditioned with fear. Some of us have had experiences with fear, that with fear. And the third one is, which is quite honestly the one I think almost all of us in this room probably deal with, and that's control. We get scared and afraid if we cannot control everything that's going on. In fact, some of us in this room not only want to control what's going on in our life, some of us in this room want to control what's going on in other people's lives as well. And so we have this fear of lack of control. If anything happens that I'm not in control of, we have this fear of what could happen or what could take place. In the book of Matthew, we're getting ready to read a story, and it's a story that follows one of the most popular stories in the book of Matthew. And Matthew has just recorded this incredible story where Jesus has taught these 5,000 people on the mountainside. And not only did he teach them, but he also fed them. And he fed them, get this, 5,000 people. He fed them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. I mean, that's the buffet of all buffets. And not only did he feed them with 5 loaves and 2 fish, but he also fed them so well that everybody was full and there was food left over. It really was a miracle. And so Matthew has just recorded that miracle. And when Jesus is done with all this, he sends the disciples, that group of 12 that he was pouring his life into, he sends them, he says, you guys go on to the other side of the lake. I'll catch up with you later, is basically what he was saying. And so you guys go on. And in Matthew chapter 14, we're going to read the story of what happened when he sent them across to the lake. Matthew 14, verse 22. It says, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that the disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified in fear. They cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." In verse 29, Jesus says, "Yes, come." So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw a strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Verse 31 says, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they explained. Pretty incredible scene here. Jesus sends them out, and in the middle of the night that sometimes happens, the wind comes up and the waves get pretty strong, and they're afraid. They're woken up, and then they see Jesus walking across the lake. Jesus was walking on the water to them. And what's interesting about this story is that these disciples were afraid. These disciples were in fear. And Peter was one of those disciples. Peter was one of those, one who just saw the miracle the day before of the feeding of the 5,000, but he was one that was woken up by the storm. He was one that was afraid because the winds were too strong. He was one of them who was afraid when they looked out and they said, "It's a ghost." Three comments I want to make about this passage. The first one is, you will never walk on water if you don't get out of the boat. You will never walk on water if you don't get out of the boat. Verses 28 and 29, he said, Peter called him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. And Jesus said, yes, come. So when Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. Now, there's some people that would say this is a failure in Peter's life because he took his eyes off of Jesus. He put his eyes on the storm and the waves and the winds and the stuff that was around him. And so when he did that, he began to sink. And so there's some people, and I've even heard preachers preach this story, that this was a failure in Peter's life. But can I tell you something? He got out of the boat. I mean, it took some faith on Peter's part, because you just think about this. It wasn't like he just poofed, was on the water. I mean, he had to take one leg and go over the side of the boat. He probably started with his big toe, and then he put the other 5 toes down. He probably put a little weight on it. And then he took his other leg and came across the side. He got out of the boat. So some people would say, Peter blew it. Peter took his eyes off of Jesus. Can I tell you something? He got out of the boat. And some of us live with such fear that we never get out of the boat. Some of us live with such fear in our lives, whether it's relationship or finances or career or marriage or children or whatever it is. We live with such fear that we're never willing to get out of the boat. And you will never walk on water if you don't get out of the boat. Here's the second point that comes from this passage, and that is this: storms will come. There are a lot of things that people can guarantee you in life. They say death and taxes are the two things that are guaranteed. I'm going to guarantee you that storms will come in your life. Now, there may be times that those storms look really not that tough and not that bad and not that significant in your life. They're just going to look like little rain showers or little rainstorms. But there's going to be some times in your life when these tropical storms are going to come up. Well, when these sort of bigger issues come up that are going to be rousing inside of you this fear of, what do I do? What decision do I make? What do I do next? And all of that. And then there's going to be some things that happen in your life that are like hurricanes that just come in and turn your world upside down and come in and just flip you upside down. Storms will come. Guaranteed. In fact, if you read the scriptures from front to back, you will read story after story after story after story of a person who was going through a storm. Some of those storms were self-induced by foolish decisions and foolish things that they did, by wandering away from God when they knew they shouldn't, by worshiping other gods when they knew not to. Some of those storms were self-induced, and some of those storms were brought on by life. And I'm here to tell you today and guarantee you today that storms are going to come in your life, and you cannot live in fear of the storm. But you have to do what Peter did in the last part of verse 30 and verse 31. He says, so when Peter got on the side of the boat, but when he saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. The third thing is, when you cry Jesus, He will be there to rescue you. You have to get out of the boat. You'll never walk on water if you don't get out of the boat. And I'm just here to tell you that storms are going to come your way. In fact, when I say that, some of you go, yeah, I got it, because I'm right in the middle of one right now. I'm right in the middle of a big storm right now. I came here today maybe even looking for an answer to the big storm that I'm in. There's a hurricane, and it's wrecking my life. It's wrecking my marriage. It's wrecking my family. It's turning my world upside down. I understand about the storm, Rick. Then you need to understand this point. When you cry Jesus, He will be there to rescue you. So often, we, even as believers, we try to handle it ourselves before we cry Jesus. We have a financial situation. We have a financial issue. Instead of crying Jesus, instead of crying out to Him, we try to figure out a way to fix it ourselves. We get overwhelmed by circumstances of children and family and responsibilities and bill collectors. And we try to figure it out ourselves before we cry out to Jesus. Can I tell you, especially as a believer, that you will always end up crying out for Jesus. So you can save yourself a whole lot of headache and a whole lot of heartbreak and a whole lot of trouble if you will just cry out to Jesus when the storms come to your life. Someone sent me a devotional that they were doing, and it just fit so great into this message. Here's what the devotional said. Get these two statements. You may want to write these down because these are pretty profound statements. What you fear reveals what you value the most. What you fear reveals what you value the most. You fear a broken relationship? That just shows that you value relationships the most. You fear financial failure. That just shows and reveals that you value money the most in your life. You fear, whatever you fear reveals what you value. And here's the second statement. What you fear also reveals where you trust God the least. What you fear also reveals where you trust God the least. You remember my definition was fear is a doubt brought on by lack of trust. And as a believer, you're only different from the world in this aspect of you have someone named Jesus Christ who has done everything to show you and teach you and push you and bring you into a relationship with Him to let you know He's on your side. The world doesn't have that. The world is out there today. People are overwhelmed today by issue after issue, hurricane after hurricane in their life, and they don't have a hope that maybe many of us do as a believer. Maybe you're here today and you say, I don't have that relationship as a believer, but I've got storm after storm after storm after storm, and maybe today it's time I cry out for Jesus. Listen to Psalm 91. And I want you to hear this, but I'm also going to encourage you in just a second to do a couple things with this chapter. This Psalm 91, the word psalm is for song, and when you read through the book of Psalms, these things were songs that were sung. And so here, get this one. In Psalm 91 it says, those who live in the shelter of the Most High will find rest in the shadow of the Almighty. Now here's the one thing I want to say before I go on reading the rest of this. When we have the shelter of the Most High, we find rest. Rest is the opposite of fear. Peace is the opposite of fear. And so instead of letting fear paralyze our lives, we need to find shelter in the Most High, and we will find rest. This I declare about the Lord. Get this. He alone is my refuge, my place of safety. He is my God, and I trust Him. For He will rescue you from every trap and protect you from deadly disease. He will cover you with His feathers. He will shelter you with His wings. His faithful promises are your armor and protection. Do not be afraid of the terrors of the night, nor the arrow that flies in the day. Do not dread the disease that stalks in darkness, nor the disaster that strikes at midday. Though 1,000 fall at your side, though 10,000s are dying around you, these evils will not touch you. Just open your eyes and see how the wicked are punished. If you make the Lord your refuge, if you make the Most High your shelter, no evil will conquer you, no plague will come near your home. For He will order His angels to protect you wherever you go. They will hold you up with their hands, and so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone. You will trample upon lions and cobras. You will crush fierce lions and serpents under your feet. The Lord says, I will rescue those who love me. I will protect those who trust in my name. When they call on me, I will answer. I will be with them in trouble. I will rescue and honor them. I will reward them with long life and give them my salvation. So let me ask you today, what fears are you living with? What are those things that you're so afraid of that they are literally paralyzing your life? What are those things that you're going through? What are those things that you're thinking about constantly, day in, day out, hour after hour after hour? What are those things in your life? And I want to encourage you today to keep your trust in Christ. He is your shelter. He is your protection. He will rescue from the storm. I want to encourage you this week to ask yourself that question. What are the areas of my life that I have this doubt, that I have this fear, that I have this lack of trust in Christ? Well, what is it? I mean, I know a lot of people who say, you know what, I've trusted God with my eternity. I've trusted Him with my salvation. I've trusted Him with my sin. I've trusted Him with all of that, but I can't trust Him with my career. I'm just not so sure He understands how it works over here in the real world. I know people who say, look, I've trusted Him from the time I was a small child and I accepted Him as my Savior. I trust that one day I will go to heaven. But I can't trust Him with these relationships that I'm seeking, or these relationships that I'm trying to find or seek, because He wouldn't understand them, or I can change them. What are those things that you fear in your life? I want to encourage you today to commit to read Psalm 91 every day this week. Maybe first thing in the morning, maybe at lunch, maybe at night, whatever works best for you. But just read that to reiterate to yourself over and over and over that regardless of what storm you're going through, regardless of how strong the winds are, regardless of how much destruction it looks like maybe going on around you, to realize and understand that the Lord will rescue you and He will protect those who trust Him. Then I want to encourage you to take it just a little bit further. And I would encourage you this week to memorize verse 1 and 2 of that chapter. Memorize. Here's what's different about reading it and memorizing it. When I have to read it, I'm going to sit down with my Bible or my iPad or my phone, and I'm going to read it. I have to have something there. But I know a lot of you work in jobs and work in spots that you just can't have that accessible. You just can't walk around all day at the hospital going, Psalm 91, Psalm 91. You can't do that. However, what I do know is that if you memorize those verses, and you have nothing around you, but you've got it up here, you've got it locked in, that you literally can walk up and down the hallways of the hospital, the hallways of the school, the hallways of your business. You can go to lunch, you can go to the restroom, and all the time you can be thinking, the Lord is my refuge, the Lord is my strength, the Lord is my refuge, the Lord is my strength. I will find rest in Him. So I want to encourage you this week to read Psalm 91, the whole chapter every day. But then to take verses 1 and 2 and commit those to memory. So that regardless of where you're at, and regardless of what you're going through, and regardless of what the storm looks like, you can remember that God is my refuge. God is my strength. I will trust in Him. Let's pray.